So, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining us today. This is the first in a series that we're running jointly with the World Alliance of International Financial Centres. My name is Simon Hardie. We are actually waiting for one of our participants to join. We've had a bit of a technical hiccup this morning with one of the registration links. So hopefully Jennifer, that you can see on the screen, the third along, will join us shortly. But this is, as I say, a new initiative that we're running, a series of webinars really looking at how financial services and fintech firms have adapted or are adapting to what's happening around them. And really now, this week and next week, to talk to a selection of financial centres around the world about, what does the world look like? Give some idea of how the markets are responding, and some insights in terms of where we go from here, and what the future, what the challenges, what the potential might be for fintech firms, financial services companies, but also financial centres. And I suppose really in the light of the great participants that we've got today, the panelists rather, to have a conversation about the role of the financial centre in a post-pandemic world. So just to kick off the introductions, we're joined today by representatives from the financial centres in London, in Frankfurt, with Jochen Biedermann, who's our co-host today, and Jochen will speak shortly. Also from Toronto with Jennifer Reynolds, and from Paris with Arnaud de Bresson, who's Vice Chairman at the Paris FinTech Cluster. This is part one, and part two next week we turn our focus eastwards, looking towards the two markets in Qatar, in Hong Kong, and looking really at what that part of the world, from a European standpoint, also what that part of the world is doing to respond to what's happening. So why are we here? Well, we as a company launched the index, our global fintech index, at the end of last year. We did that because we were aware of the enormous variety of financial services innovation that was going on across the world. And we were also aware that it was becoming quite unclear as to where some of the innovation hotspots were. The assumption was that financial innovation was coming from London, it was coming from New York, it was coming from Hong Kong, or possibly these days Shanghai or Singapore. But also we were aware that there are other places where innovation was coming from. And we really wanted to sort of start to understand how financial services and fintech both are converging, but are also changing the marketplace. So we launched something called the City Index at the end of last year. That will actually go live online in a few weeks, later into May. And that really looks at all cities worldwide where there's a degree of fintech activity, and we've started to put them into some sort of order, just in terms of the breadth, the depth, and the quality of the fintech activity in those locations. And the plan really will be to build that out so that there's a more in-depth database, company database on fintech firms worldwide. As I say, I'm joined today by a great group of panelists. Jennifer isn't online yet, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to bring her in a few minutes, a bit later into the session now. But first, I'd like just to turn to each one of our panelists, just for them to give their views on the situation as they find it in their locations, their view of of what's happening, and some of the sort of challenges, and perhaps a view of how their region, their market is going to come out of this crisis. Before we do that, I'd just like to, as I say, welcome Mr. Biedermann, who's over in Frankfurt, our co-host today. Jochen, over to you for your welcome. And welcome today, and thank you for being with us.
Simon, first of all, thank you very much for that kind introduction. We are really thrilled, really excited to do these two webinars with you, and hopefully more will follow. I speak on behalf of all members of the World Alliance of International Financial Centers. Maybe to kick it off, let me say a few words on the World Alliance, what we are doing, and what are our members. Our objective, our vision is to organize a collaboration between leading international financial centers. We are convinced that this collaboration between the financial center is of utmost importance because financial services is global these days, and also a network of financial centers is required. Collaboration between financial centers is required to fulfill the needs of a globalized world in terms
Thank you very much.
of financial services. You can see here our members, which are, as I said, leading financial centers, also mid-sized financial centers. We have currently 16 members actively working together. Sometimes people ask about financial centers. They're also in competition. This is true. Some of our financial centers, they also compete for business, but the more they work together in topics like fintech, as we discussed today, sustainable finance. And these days, in particular, we are discussing and trying to support the economic recovery from the current pandemic. This is something which affects almost all businesses, and financial centers think of how they can contribute to the economic recovery. Fintech, our topic for today, we are talking about many startups which have nowadays more issues in getting funding, also maybe more issues in serving their clients, their B2B fintechs. This is what we want to discuss today and give you the perspective today from Toronto, from London, and from Paris. And next week we will add the perspective then from Hong Kong, from Qatar, and from Luxembourg. And I hope we have a nice exchange of thoughts on what financial centers can do to help their fintech ecosystems.
Thank you very much.
Also, maybe a final sentence. We have recently launched a few publications on that topic. Here on that slide, you see our address there for free of charge download. Have a look and see what we are doing in general in terms of the economic recovery. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to Jennifer, if she is around now. Yes. Jennifer is the President and CEO of Toronto Finance International, and we are very much looking forward to her view on the very successful fintech ecosystem in Toronto, and to what extent it's affected, and or what are maybe even the opportunities out of this crisis. Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jochen. Can I just say, somebody may have their microphone unmuted and there's a bit of background noise. So if we could just make sure that we mute when we're speaking, that'd be helpful. Jennifer, thank you. Welcome. Sorry about the technical hitch. Welcome.
Thank you, and delighted to be chatting with everyone today. So I thought just to give a little bit of background for those who might not know much about the Toronto Financial Centre and the fintech ecosystem here, just to give you a sense of the scope of the fintech ecosystem. Our financial center is the second largest in North America, and the tech cluster that actually surrounds the Toronto region is the third largest tech cluster in North America. So not only do we have a huge concentration of workers within the financial sector here, we also have a huge concentration of workers within the technology sector. And so that's been fortunate for us in that it's fostered the growth of quite a large fintech ecosystem. We've had the highest investment rate in in fintech, actually globally over the last few years in terms of venture capital investing. So we've really seen that flourish, which is great. And if you think about, you know, the importance of the financial sector to Canada, it's a key pillar. It's one of our largest contributors to GDP. So very important. And the competitiveness of that sector clearly depends on innovation and fostering that innovation ecosystem around the larger incumbent traditional financial players. So we've been fortunate that has, it's developed, I would say, organically, but we've also in Canada really tried to foster that through different programs with the government, with the financial sector, investing in things like accelerators and incubators to make sure that it really is supporting that growth. It takes the whole, you know, it takes academia, it takes the partnerships with the large financial institutions, it takes the government supporting programs, which help these younger fintechs grow within the economy. So that has all come together quite well, I would say, in Canada. So that's kind of where we are today. You know, we're sort of seen as the Silicon Valley of the North here in Toronto, is often how we're referred to. And so clearly that permeates into the fintech ecosystem as well. And as we think, obviously, in today's context, clearly these are challenging times. They're challenging times for everyone. But, you know, we in Canada, and I suspect others will comment on this, if you think about just small business and you think about the technology ecosystem, you know, this is a knowledge economy. The last thing we want is those workers not to be, or companies forced to lay off workers like that. So in Canada, we're very focused. That's every part of the economy is of importance right now, but making sure we don't lose all that we've gained in the technology sector and in fintech in particular is very important right now. So I'll just, you know, I'll close my opening comments just by talking about some of the programs that we have in place, because in Canada right now, both from the financial sector and government, to help support the whole economy, which obviously is translating into the fintech sector and into small business generally. 99% of companies in Canada would be categorized as small and medium-sized businesses. So clearly this is a critical part of the economy. So what we're seeing the financial sector do to step up right now is a variety of things. We have interest-free loans right now to small and medium-sized business. We have loan guarantee programs, which the banks have put in place. There's been very coordinated action in Canada by the financial institutions, by the banks and government to support both individuals and businesses. And that obviously has benefited the technology and fintech ecosystem as well. There's deferrals on small business loans happening right now. We have certain employment benefits in place to pay employees, which are coming from the government. And even things like insurance. The insurance sector has stepped up and is reducing premiums right now for things like automobile insurance. Obviously, no one's driving anywhere. So there are a variety of different supports which are happening to hopefully keep this fintech ecosystem flourishing and obviously keep the overall economy going. So I'll leave it at that, and obviously we can delve into our conversation later on and answer any further questions.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Arnaud, could we come over to jump over to Europe and hear what's happening financial services and fintech in Paris, please?
Thank you very much. Possibly two comments. First, concerning the WAIFC, the World Financial Center Alliance that Jochen has presented. Even more important today to develop the dialogue between international financial centers to explain what is the role of the financial centers today in the economy and even more in the crisis, and illustrate how the financial centers are part of the solution in the post-crisis period. This crisis will completely change the picture, and we see that we will have new priorities after this COVID-19 crisis, like to think again about the way companies, corporates, businesses, as well as the states are financed because of the huge increase of the debt. Second, to accelerate sustainable finance and the contribution of the financial industry to environment, but also social issues. And last but not least, to accelerate financial innovation and the development of the fintech, which is the subject of today. These are the topics on which WAIFC is working today, and it is why we need to share our experience, our practices, and why this organization is even more useful to prepare this post-crisis period. Second, about Paris and the fintech issues. Since almost 10 years, we have launched different programs to develop financial innovation, not only with SMEs, but also with the industry, the banking, the insurance sector that Jennifer has mentioned, to see how we can accelerate innovation, digital practices, and development of new technologies in the financial industry. And also to help accompany the development of startups of the fintech. Paris today is a leading financial center in Europe, with London, with Frankfurt, and we also work together. We are a leading center for fintech with almost 800 startups which are developing activities in artificial intelligence, big data, risk management, sustainable finance, insurtech today, and the creation of a financial services cluster that Paris EUROPLACE is managing, as well as to think about the regulation, work about the development of sandbox practices to facilitate and make a more flexible regulation for the fintech, and also to create specific funds dedicated to accompany and finance the fintech startups and accelerate the development of this fintech. Just a last comment to say that in the post-crisis, all these issues will be even more important, and today to illustrate and to show and explain how this fintech in many fields, in the insurance, in the wealth management, in the sustainable finance, in the social finance, contribute to help to solve this difficult crisis that we have today.
Thank you very much, Arnaud. Thank you for that, and I couldn't agree more. You know, there's definitely a need for stronger collaboration, and and hopefully the crisis that we're in or coming into or out of will drive that forward. Wayne, perhaps we can turn over to you in London. We've been hearing a lot, obviously, particularly at our end. We're a UK company anyway, but London's success at building itself as a fintech hub has been well documented. Give us your perspective on how the city is feeling at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Well, first of all, just a brief introduction to the TheCityUk. We are the largest membership body representing financial and related professional services in the UK. We lobby hard on behalf of their interests. Our strength is that our membership comes from right across the industry, so it's not just about banks or law firms or accountants. We cover all of those professions, and we also work with our sister trade associations. So Innovate Finance would be leading on fintech at the moment in the UK, the Law Society on Legal Services, and UK Finance and on Banking, etc. But our strength is that we bring all of those organisations and our various members under one umbrella when we're trying to tackle issues like we face at the moment. And we have been asked by the Governor of the Bank of England to look at how the industry will respond to the crisis as we draw to a close, as it draws to a close. I would absolutely endorse everything that previous speakers have said. You know, now is the time that we should be working together globally. We should be avoiding issues that are coming up. We're already seeing calls for protectionism. The last thing we want at the moment is protectionism. We still need to keep trading. We still need to keep markets open. And WAIFC has a role for coordinating a global response to the crisis. In the UK, the economic forecast suggests that as the UK will come out of lockdown, businesses will be facing tougher trading conditions than before COVID-19. And this will make it hard for them to service the extra debt that they've taken on. In addition, these businesses will need to borrow more money to help them maintain and restart their trading, their business. And the demands of this debt will compromise the growth and viability of many UK businesses, putting jobs and economic growth in the UK at risk. So we are facing a real and genuine crisis. And recognising this, that the British, recognising the challenges that the British industry faces, the UK government, in Canada, has responded with far-reaching stimulus packages, and these are aimed at small businesses, large businesses, right across the country. Altogether, there are 8 packages or various loans and schemes that are available to industry. Perhaps the one most of interest to this discussion is that there's a £1.25 billion coronavirus package to protect firms to drive in innovation in the UK. And this is aimed specifically at the fintech market and also at businesses within that sector which are unable to make use of the other loans and schemes are available. Many businesses across the UK are using the schemes I just mentioned and using also private liquidity or private sector investment to provide liquidity to weather the lockdown. So we are seeing a real response to the challenges that are being thrown up to us from government and by the private sector as well. And a lot of this is being driven by fintech, and fintech is changing the very way that the financial sector across the UK is working. I mean, the very fact that we're having this conference today by Zoom is an obvious example. And Innovate Finance, who I mentioned earlier on, they've got their fintech week finishing this week, and they've done all the meetings and presentations that they would have done normally in a building in London. They've done them all by virtual means. So we're already seeing changes to the way that we work, and I think the City of London Corporation in particular are looking at the wider impact and how we're going to be working in the future. And the industry faces a significant challenge in responding to the evolving COVID pandemic. And although the long-term impacts remain unclear, we're already seeing those changes in the change in they work and how they use digital technology. And again, fintech is responding to some of the issues. You know, our regulators are facing calls for regulatory forbearance and changes to reporting requirements. And we've seen how fintech solutions are being offered to solve some of these issues which have occurred because we weren't all expecting to be working at home. This is particularly valid to auditors and to legal services and the requirements for wet signatures on contracts. So fintech in the UK is evolving to tackle many of these issues that we hadn't really considered or thought about before. So I'm very positive about the way the future is developing. So I'm looking forward to the rest of this debate today. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Very good. The purpose of today, of course, was to talk about the recovery and coming out of this, or coming out of lockdown and emerging into arguably quite a substantially different type of economy. Some dimensions of which will certainly outlast the pandemic itself. I wonder, could we get some views perhaps on from the point of view of the recovery? Early early on in the lockdown in Europe, we were talking to bankers, both large banks and smaller ones, about what were going to be the sort of the impacts on them. In the early days of it, of course, they were feeling quite buoyant. They felt that many banks were feeling that they'd lost the upper hand from fintech firms over the last few years. But of course, they've rebuilt their balance sheets in the intervening period since the financial crisis, and were feeling quite bullish. Whereas fintech firms, of course, are they're younger, they may be more agile, but their finances are of a different picture. Quite a lot of fintech firms are not profit making; they're fast growth companies. So although the agility and the adaptability of fintech firms, arguably, well, certainly an advantage, their financial stability, is perhaps more questionable in an enduring recession. So I wonder, what views do we have in terms of what the recovery is going to look like? And I suppose not so much who's going to be the winners, whether it's incumbents versus innovators, because it's probably a bit of both. But what will that mean in terms of the future of financial services as a marketplace, both in Europe, but also, of course, in your neck of the woods, Jennifer, in North America. Jennifer, perhaps do you want to sort of come back at that?
Sure. It's interesting because I've had this question a couple of times over the last week or so. Is this, in terms of thinking about partnerships between fintechs and large institutions, is this going to increase that or decrease that? And I think that's an important question. My view is, I think we've already seen obviously a massive trend towards the digitalization of the economy, and certainly financial sector, of course. And I think we're only going to see that accelerate now. Let's hope we all do get to go back to the office and back to normal. But I think fundamentally, we are going to see more remote working going forward, more than we would have seen historically. I think this is, even if we get past this pandemic, I do think there is going to be a bit of a cultural shift on, do we need to go to the office every day? Do we have to go to the branch to do something that we used to do that we could just sit in our house and do? And I think part of that was socio-demographic, right? If you think about older generations, they might more typically be, less used to working online and so might be going to the branch for certain things. So I actually think we're going to have a higher adoption rate, a faster adoption rate of fintech under these conditions. And so that's going to require, certainly the large incumbents have innovation happening within their institution, of course, but they're going to need partnerships. They can't move. They're not as nimble. They do need to get at that innovation ecosystem, which exists in the fintech community. So, I'm bullish. I would say that there's going to be huge opportunity for the fintechs coming out of this. I think right now, and coming out of it, once we get past the initial crisis mode, we're obviously a few weeks behind in North America here. But I think the key is something I touched on earlier, and also Wayne touched on, is we need to support these smaller companies through these times, because we can't have them go down in the first 6 months because they don't have the capital to survive. We've got to help them get through so that they can be those partners for the future for the big incumbents. So these support programs are absolutely critical. And I think from the Canadian perspective, our government has tried to get at helping different parts of our economy, and sometimes the programs don't suit the innovation or technology ecosystem. Just to give one example, we had one program in place for wage subsidies where you had to show a decline in revenues. And when you're a VC funded institute, it's not the same thing. You wouldn't have seen that decline in revenues, but you still need that wage subsidy. So now we've had to readjust those programs, and now there's programs which are directed at the technology community. So I think that's the critical thing right now for us to all think about, is how do we support these companies through this period so that they can be those partners for the future, for the innovation we're going to need.
Sure. No, Jennifer. Arnaud, I mean, we know, of course, that, and you mentioned, that France, and particularly Paris, has put a lot of work and effort into developing an innovation community, a fintech. You've got this Station F, I think you have. There's a big fintech hub. What are fintech firms feeling there? And obviously, you know, the UK, I know they've announced, you know, a support package for innovation startup type firms. I think that was kind of quite, you know, quite similar to what the government in France announced, you know, shortly before that. What's your take on how your, you know, how your members, how your fintech firms feeling? Are they feeling sort of anxious, but you know, a bit like Jennifer was saying, quite a little bit bullish as well? What's the take on that?
Yes, I wanted to support what Jennifer has said. We also are bullish about the way the fintech can be part of the solution of this crisis. Just to add what Jennifer has said, that I was mentioning just before, that many fintech are developing new services which are very useful in this crisis, with more proximity than the big companies or big banks, in terms of social finance, in terms of wealth management, in terms of insurance, and which are very useful and are perceived like very positive contributions in this crisis, with some real added value compared to, let's say, the older system. And this is, I think, one of the first lessons of this period that we are going across. And for this reason, I think fintech are showing that they can be very useful. Second, I also share the view of Jennifer that the relationship between the fintech and the big companies, the big banks, big insurance companies, is accelerating because these companies, the big companies are more and more aware about the way the fintech can be a part of the solution and can bring new perspectives in terms of necessary innovation and, let's say, the proximity with the clients and the consumers. Last but not least, third point to answer to your question, you know that, yes, let's say since the election of Emmanuel Macron, we have in France a government much more supportive for the business world, and more especially for the innovation. And since Macron has become a president, we have seen a lot of new disposals, both on the public side and on the private side, to develop financing of companies and to accompany the development of these startups, including to accompany growing the scale-up of the company. So we have recently, and I just take this example, launched a new dedicated funds to accompany the high-growing companies in all the tech sectors, including the fintech sectors, with some, let's say, significant capacities in terms of financing, which are part today of the solution. Last point, for us, one of the next steps will be to think about the risk that we have today with this growing debt, both from the governments as well as from businesses, big companies, and even more small and mid-sized companies, which have a growing debt with potential difficulties in terms of rating issues, in terms of investment capacities, and so on. So we are thinking here in Paris about the way to relaunch the possibility for companies to access to capital, to the stock exchange, and to see how to rebalance the private equity developments with the stock exchange developments, which are necessary to accelerate in the future, to give the possibility to companies, even small and mid-sized companies, to meet their capital requirements and preserve their investment capacities. This is quite an important thing, including for the fintech sector, and we are working on this.
Yeah, thank you, Arnaud. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think there's definitely a need for a more liquid market that sort of doesn't cut off the smaller company, the growing companies, and it doesn't restrict them to the sort of shadow banking and sort of private venture capital system. Absolutely. I want to turn, because we are rattling through the time. Just a couple of housekeeping points. Please do send us your questions. This is your opportunity. We've got a truly global cast here today. These are experts in financial markets. Please send us your questions, and we'll try and get to them. If we can't come to them in the session, we will come to you afterwards and come back with an answer or an introduction to the relevant person that might be able to help you afterwards. There's also a poll. We've launched the poll already, so if you haven't taken part in that on your screen, please press the button and vote. The question is, how important is location to the success of financial services firms? With a sort of range of answers, from very important to no longer makes a difference. Just in terms of a tally at the minute, the answer that has the most followership is becoming less important. Nearly half of the pollers so far say that financial location for financial services firms is becoming less important, and one person even thinks it no longer makes a difference. And that certainly ties in with the findings that we were looking at from the index, excuse me, the index and the rankings that we produced at the end of last year. And it's the location that I want to turn now, really, because it's a very interesting, conceptually, it's a very interesting question, isn't it? We're all in a location, but we're not in a location. We're all working, but we're all working virtually. So the question starts to become, does location really matter anymore? Wayne, I'm going to come to you in a minute, and you'll understand why. But the interesting thing about fintech, of course, is that when fintech came around after the financial crisis about a decade ago, it was spurred by quite catastrophic financial failure in New York and in London in particular, and all these talented people that were working for financial services went to work or founded fintech firms. Over the intervening decade, that's continued, and our index has shown that New York and London are at the top, and Toronto, Paris also feature, as does Frankfurt, of course. But it's also showed that non-traditional centres are able to compete at a global level when it comes to fintech. We've seen places like Lithuania, which does very well as a country, and Vilnius does very well as a city, scoring very highly. We've also seen places like Sao Paulo, Brazil, Bogota in Colombia, cities in India, and of course then there's China, that have also appeared at the very top of the rankings of locations where there are deep pockets of fintech activity. So Wayne, perhaps I can come to you. I don't want to spotlight you here, but London has always been a strong financial centre. It's built a very successful fintech centre. Do you think that this crisis is going to impact not so much its importance, but is it going to have a sort of psychological impact on whether it's important to be in one city versus another? You're on mute.
It's for me?
That's for Wayne, sorry.
Sorry,
For Wayne.
okay. Sorry. Yeah, I'm off mute now. Yes, well, first of all, just to pick up something on which Jennifer said. Interestingly, we've been done some, obviously, I'm a part of the management team at TheCityUk, and we're actually polling our staff almost constantly on the return and when we're going to go back to work. And it's, although I fully accept that older people like me struggle with fintech, interestingly, it's the younger people who want to come back to work because they miss the social contact. And I'm sitting quite comfortably in a nice house in the country, so it's nice for me to work from home. But if you're in a small flat in London, you can't get out, the younger people are actually saying we want to come back to work. So it's an interesting social reflection. But on the broader question, though, I think yes, we are going to see changes. But one of the reasons why London has been a successful financial centre and has grown as a fintech centre is the depth and the breadth of the offer that you get from working in London, and also the opportunities that employs, or rather the opportunity that offers to employers and to staff. So you have a large cluster, and it's the same for any financial centre, international financial. You know, you have a centre of expertise, and it's easier to move around staff, and there are job opportunities and the rest of it. Now, fintech doesn't necessarily work in the same method as that. But you know, if we look at how, and actually go back to the crisis first of all, for just for conventional companies, you know, finding funding is going to be key to how we survive this crisis. And you know, if you're a FTSE 100 company, you can get funding. You can have share issues or whatever you want to do. If you're an SME, you're not in that market, so you've got to borrow money from somebody, and they've been asking for equity in return. If you're a family business which has been in your family for 100 years, you might not want to give those sort of opportunities up. So that leads me to fintech companies, and fintech companies have in the past, especially the small young ones, the startups, have not really used the traditional banking systems. You know, they've been funded by crowdfunding or angels or micro venture capital programs. So and it goes back to what Jennifer was saying. We've got to find a way to support these small companies, perhaps not in the way we have done in the past, perhaps not through traditional funding sources. But having said all that, I think we will see changes in the way businesses work. We will see the way people actually are employed, and you know, will we have more working from home? I'd like to think we will, but at the end of the day, you know, this is going to take a long time to transition, but it's bound to affect you know, the infrastructure and the real estate around every large financial centre. I think all of us are looking at that and the potential impact of that.
Yeah. Thank you.
But then, having said that, you know, if you're starting up your business and you're based outside a major financial centre, then you've got to find a way to fund it. So eventually, you're going to go back to that financial centre. Well, now whether we can do that through virtual means is something that I think we need to explore. But certainly, you know, that would be the way forward, I think.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Wayne, for that. Jochen, perhaps we could just turn to you. You know, at WAIFC, you know, obviously you're Frankfurt. You yourself are Frankfurt based. There's been a lot of reference, obviously, to fintech and small and mid-sized firms in general. What's happening, you know, in the heart of Europe, at the home of the European Central Bank? I mean, did they see, and are you talking to stakeholders in Frankfurt about support for, you know, more support for innovative smaller businesses, particularly fintech firms? And what's the feedback you're getting?
Yeah. Of course, there are different observations. One very simple, I think there's some sort of cleansing in the market. Access to funding is become more difficult, in particular if you're not profitable or you won't be profitable in the next 12 months. So valuation is going down. On the other hand, there are very exciting times. We have never, you know, envisaged, you know, governments doing technical hackathons. So this is totally new, or supporting decentralization. So I could never dream of that. This is done on a governmental level. On the other hand, more and more fintech companies here in Europe, in Germany, focusing on SME financing. SME financing, in particular these days, is very critical, having short-term bridge loans, and fintechs, or some fintechs are faster in doing so. And now they're in discussion with the government for getting a fair share of government subsidizes, loans and so on, support loans, that they also can distribute it to their SME clients, which is an ongoing debate. Last point I want to add also to what Wayne said before. we should have in mind that fintech is not necessarily, you know, monolithic, standalone startups, rolling out a certain service, but also in fintech we see more and more supply chains. Let me call it like this, like we see in business overall. And these supply chains also might be affected, like other supply chains are affected. Fintechs have a critical dependency on service providers, some of them even other fintechs, in terms of digital identity, in terms of maybe having a regulatory umbrella by a bank, and so on and so forth. So I think managing these supply chains will become more critical. You know, very important partner maybe is not available anymore. Then yeah, a whole system can break down. And this is a little bit the risk I see, and we need to observe this in the coming months. But overall, there are also, let me mention blockchain, let me mention AI. In particular, you know, in between classical fintech topics and then, you know, the pandemic topics of Corona apps and so on.
Very good. Thank you very much for that, Jochen. Thank you for those comments. That does sort of tie us on really quite nicely to what will have to be our last part of this session today. We've had a question which I'll bring into this sort of final part, which is from a London viewer. What is the view from panelists on operational resilience and the role different types of fintech can play when we recover? It does bring into this whole question, this very interesting question again. There's a lot of interesting questions at the moment. This whole idea around resilience, both the role of fintech in enabling resilience, but also, you know, the role of regulation and being better prepared for, you know, a future crisis. I think most commentators seem to be of the agreement now that kind of the globally networked world that we live in is going to be at risk from more crises, not fewer, if we don't put the systems in place to be prepared for them. Do we have a view of, you know, how fintech might enable greater operational resilience, you know, not just across financial services and for individual firms, but across the economy? And, you know, what might the role of regulation be going forward into enabling some of that innovation to play a part in a post-pandemic world? Perhaps from a North America perspective, Jennifer, do you get a sense of, you know, how resilience, you know, might be achieved after the crisis? You're on mute, I think. Oh,
yes, I think it certainly is going to play a critical role. We're going to, you know, as we all, you know, I sit on a bank board myself, and you always go through all the different scenarios and stress testing. And I can tell you, you know, the pandemic one wasn't necessarily at the top of the charts of what we were thinking about 6 months ago. So this has changed, you know, the paradigm, changed the thinking for everyone, and resilience will be absolutely top of mind. And you know, I think, you know, as we think about climate, that, to my mind, is going to be, you know, that could be the next crisis, right, where we face something significant like this. And so I think resiliency is going to be thought about in a very different way. I think regulation, to your point, will play into that. We've seen some regulatory changes happen very quickly in Canada because, you know, certain things, even simple things like, you know, wet signatures required for certain things in the financial services sector, which is just, you know, we can't function that way, right? So there's all sorts of different implications and different ways we're going to think about resiliency, and therefore the only solution for that is innovation and technology. So there's huge opportunity around the whole thinking in resiliency, and I think we'll just find it's, you know, there's new solutions we're going to require which we never thought about before. So you know, it's a different world from that perspective.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jennifer. Arnaud, obviously, you know, Europe has been very progressive in its financial services regulation in any case. You know, well before all of this, we've had PSD2 in the UK, we've had open banking as, you know, connected to that. We've now, of course, got GDPR and sort of data controls. What do you see? Is regulation going to adapt, and how might that be going forward?
For us, we see two major issues. The first is about the way Europe, because we are in Europe, is concerned with the objectives, necessity to organize a good balance in the regulation, mostly for startups, tech companies, and the fintech, compared to, let's say, the old principles of the regulation. And we see today important moves and changes in the way Europe is going to more flexible views on the way the regulation must be applied to these startups companies. And I mentioned the sandbox approach and issue. That's quite interesting to see that the regulatory authorities and on European level, the necessity of a more flexible approach for these companies is considered today, as well as optional approaches like in France for startups, and the way to use the regulation and organize the good mix between the necessity to accompany these new, innovative and creative companies and the protection of the consumers. This is the first point. And the second point for me is about the very big priority which is given today in Europe, but also all around the world, in a new ESG and sustainable finance and economy issues. And this is another part of the subject. Fintech can contribute, but the objective also is to for the authorities to make that the lessons of this crisis are also that we have to accelerate sustainable issues, to give more focus to environment and social issues, to give the priority to startups in these sectors, to give the priority to funding of companies which are in the objective to respect these new ESG objectives, and to make that the regulation is adapted for that. It's the objective of the Green Deal on European level, which has been launched by the new commissioner, Mrs. van der Leyen. And we are very involved in all these issues, and we know that we will talk more and more about that on an international basis, in the G20, in the G7 meetings. Last but not least, we are talking about today about the World Financial Center organization, but there is another organization with which we have some connections, which is a Financial Sustainable Centers organization, which is co-chaired by France and China. And we are talking about these new priorities in terms of developing the contribution of the financial center and the financial industry to these new necessary goals in terms of environment, social and governance issues for the next steps after this crisis. And this is also a question of the regulation, the way the regulation will consider and take into account these new priorities.
Thank you very much, Arnaud. Wayne, perhaps from you, just a final couple of words, not so much more on the regulation, but in terms of the opportunities now for fintech companies, financial services firms in general. I mean, at the end of every, the old phrase of "don't waste a crisis" sort of rings true every time we have this sort of situation, seemingly every 10 years. So coming out of this now, going forward, where is the opportunity, and how are sort of cities like London and the financial services communities going to sort of take advantage of some of the things, if one can say that, some of the things that are happening now?
Okay, yeah. Oh, sorry, I'm still on mute.
No, you're not on mute. It's okay. You're on mute now.
Sorry.
There we go.
Yeah, I think the key issues are, and colleagues have reference to the sandbox. And the sandbox system has been great for all the regulators that have brought it in and to develop, help fintech develop. We now have to move on to that concept, and I think that applies not just to regulation, but right across the piece. Our economic research team have looked at the current crisis and compared it to the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. And one of their recommendations, or one of their things that they're saying, is that we can't compare this pandemic crisis with the previous crisis, because previously it really only impacted on financial centres, and this one is a global crisis. So there are lots of lessons to be drawn from that. And I think what we're going to have to look forward to is as colleagues have said earlier on, is new ways of working, new ways of thinking, and fintech will bring that. Fintech will enable that as we go forward. That we will, it will be a chance for people. We've had challenger banks as a consequence of the last global financial crisis, and and fintech has been played a huge part on that. So I think as we go forward, fintech will help us improve financial services, and also deliver those financial services to the people who are unbanked at the moment. And this also touches on ESG issues. There are still a lot of people in the world who are unbanked. We ran a small project last year on Sharia fintech, Islamic fintech, and that was very interesting, because there's a huge demand for those products across Africa, across the Middle East, across Asia. But and there are innovative products being developed. But again, we go back to how do we fund those projects. So I think there's great potential in fintech providing part of the solution to how we get out of the global crisis. I also think it's very important that we have dialogues like this. Yesterday, we just published a paper with Economy Swiss on industry views on working together between UK and Switzerland, especially as the EU, UK beats EU. We're also working, with the Global Services Coalition. So as long as people are talking to each other across the world, then I think we can find a way out of this, and fintech is going to be a key part of that.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jochen. Yes, please.
Before we close, let me ask you a question, if I may. With findexable, you evaluate fintech ecosystems, right? So do you foresee any change in terms of your criteria after the crisis? Will certain things become more important for you?
Well, I think there's two dimensions to that. I think one is, on one level, we see a deepening of what we found, basically. Actually, I can show you on the screen here just very briefly before we close. What we found really was this sort of, that fintech was enabling much greater globalization, internationalization of financial services. And we see a deepening of that going forward. I think there will be some corrections. There's going to be a challenge. My signal might be a bit weak. There's going to be a challenge for those firms that are dependent on raising capital. Of course there are. It's going to be very difficult for a lot of fintech firms. We've been talking to people in Africa, South America, emerging Asia this last few weeks, and it's going to be challenging. So in spite of that, we do think there's going to be a deepening of globalization. And I think, to everybody's point, there's sort of agreement on this whole sustainability angle. I think what's quite exciting potentially, and it's possibly a bold word to use given the challenges that many people are facing, but I think what is going to be quite exciting is that places that are what used to be considered the fringes of the world are going to have access not just to a market but to people that they wouldn't have had access to previously. We are talking now about talent being reachable well across borders. One could argue that was possible before, but I think the step change that the pandemic has enabled, this kind of acceptance that remote working is possible, and that it doesn't necessarily, I think fundamentally isn't necessarily going to impinge on the value of a fintech company if their workforce is primarily or largely a remote workforce. I think that's going to enable not just companies in emerging regions to do well fintech and compete with the traditional heavyweights in the West or in Asia, but also both to improve access and for places, for companies rather, to be able to start attracting much brighter people, so that you haven't necessarily got, as we've had in previous crises, this constant brain drain where a crisis causes a flight to quality because people have to go where there are jobs, and hopefully that's some of the advantage that might come out of this. So I think there's going to be a positive outcome, but clearly there's going to be some pain in the intervening, whatever it is, year to 2 years before we start to see the kind of real impact. Very good, gentlemen, and Jennifer, of course. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's really been a pleasure. As I say, we're back next week when we look eastward. We're joined by Jochen once again as co-host, but also we're joined by financial centres in Hong Kong, in Qatar, and also Luxembourg. So we're looking forward to welcoming everybody next week. Thank you again for joining us today. The webinar is recorded, so it will be made live and sent to everybody that's joined, and it'll also be viewable online afterwards for anybody that hasn't. We do find that we get quite a lot of downloads after the event, so hopefully we'll get more of those as well. And just a final word on the poll before we close. The sort of majority really thinks that financial service firms, location is still quite important, but the verdict seems also to be that location is becoming less important. So an interesting take as we come out of lockdown and into hopefully something resembling normality. Jochen, thank you again for co-hosting today. To Jennifer, to Arnaud, and to Wayne, thank you for being with us, and I hope we can do this again sometime soon. Stay well, stay safe, and stay sane, and hopefully one day we can do these meetings in person and live. Take care. Thank you again.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Jochen.
Bye.
The rating.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
Have a great day.